Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. I can see that a number of people are logging in, and so we'll just wait a couple of minutes to give them a chance to join us. Right, it's good to see that people are joining. So maybe we'll kick off. Thank you to all of you for logging in to join us this afternoon. As I'm sure you're aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has really presented some very unique challenges to the African economies. But it's interesting to see that the responses to the pandemic across the continent by governments have been quite different. And accordingly, it seems like some of the economic impacts will also be quite different. Today is going to focus on some of these developments and is also going to talk about how we expect them to impact on the work of African regulators, in particular competition regulators, but not only limited to them, and to think a little bit about how this might affect investment in the continent, which is obviously an issue of big importance for us and also for our clients at Bowmans. So our panel today is an esteemed one, and we invite you to post any burning questions that you have for our panel using the Q&A function in the Zoom link. We'll do our very best to answer your questions as we go along, and we have allocated plenty of time for that. But we'll also try and respond in due course if we don't get to any particular questions in the time we have available. And we also invite you to participate in our online poll. We've put together a couple of questions which we think are really interesting. We'd be grateful if you participate and let us have your views. It is an anonymous poll, and then we'll share the results of that poll towards the end of the session. So let's kick off and welcome our panelists today in no particular order of either brains or beauty. Firstly, two of our newer Bowmans partners in Malawi and Zambia, who joined us with effect from the 1st of June this year. Bwalya Chilufya-Musonda is based in Lusaka in Zambia, and Elton Jangale is our managing partner of our new office in Lilongwe in Malawi. Then also we'll have Dr. Wilbert Kapinga, who's the managing partner of our office in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Shianee Calcutteea in Mauritius, Joyce Karanja, our partner in Kenya, and David Mpanga, who's our partner in Uganda. And last but not least, the co-head of our competition team, who's based in our Cape Town office in South Africa, Tamara, Dini. Right, so let's kick off. The first topic I'd like to cover is what the approach of your country has been to the pandemic, what measures you put in place to deal with it, and what you think the impact of this is going to be on your particular economy going forward. And Bwalya, it would be great if you could kick off for us from a Zambian perspective. Bwalya, you're on mute. No, we still can't hear you. Sorry, Bwalya. If we had a rand for every time someone said you're on mute over the last couple of weeks. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Okay. So the state of the economy was a huge concern in deciding the type of lockdown that Zambia would be subject to. So various regulations and presidential directives were passed pursuant to the Public Health Act, and these basically had the effect of giving us a partial lockdown. So what this meant was that business was supposed to continue as usual, but cautiously. But other measures that had been passed included that those who could stay home were encouraged to do so. And
that's Zambia.
Yes, that's for Zambia. So schools were closed, and on 1st June, only those in examination classes were permitted to resume classes. Restaurants were required to operate on a takeaway basis only. These have since reopened. Nightclubs and bars were closed, and these continue to be closed. So in spite of the partial lockdown, the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic have been quite harsh on Zambia. This is with the GDP growth rate expected to be at about 1.7% from an initial projection of 3%. The IMF have actually projected a real GDP growth rate of negative 3.5%. Contributing to the harsh economic times is basically that we've had a reduced demand for copper. And as you will know, copper constitutes about 70% of Zambia's exports. Our tourism and hospitality industry, which contributes about 7% to Zambia's GDP, has also been hard hit. The kwacha has also depreciated by about 28% from the beginning of the pandemic.
Tamara, how does that contrast with what we've seen in South Africa?
Thanks, Heather. And it's great to join this webinar with so many of our partners from across the continent. It's good to see everybody, and thank you to Heather for arranging this. South Africa went into a hard lockdown from the 27th of March, with only essential service providers being able to operate at that initial stage. So essentially our economy drew to a standstill at that point. People were only allowed to leave their homes to buy food and to source medicines, and quite controversially, the sale of alcohol and tobacco was banned. There was a slight relaxation of the initial measures in early May, but still many businesses were not allowed to operate. And it can only be said that we've started reopening our economy with effect from the 1st of June. Of course, it's been very challenging for the South African government to try to balance the objectives of saving lives by flattening the infection curve and trying to preserve livelihoods with a very gradual reopening of the economy. Even with the stringent measures taken in South Africa, as of today, we have more than 100,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And of course, the impact of the hard lockdown on the economy has been devastating. For those businesses that have managed to survive at this stage, there's still uncertainty for many of them as to whether their clients and customer base will also survive, and if so, for how long. We've already seen a number of multinationals reassessing their South African operations, and if they weren't thriving in the past, the current situation has certainly exacerbated the position of those. SMEs have been impacted negatively, especially those in tourism and the hospitality sectors. And I expect that we'll see consolidation in these areas going forward. In South Africa, there's enormous pressure on the government to try to protect businesses at this time, particularly in light of our unemployment crisis. To put this into perspective, the South African Reserve Bank expects our GDP to contract by 7% in 2020. The unemployment rate in South Africa prior to COVID-19 was at a staggering 26%, and the Chamber of Commerce has predicted that this could rise to 50%. In a survey conducted by Stats SA before the middle of April, only 50% of businesses expected that they wouldn't be reducing their number of employees after the lockdown. So it's understandable that at the start of the lockdown, a survey showed that while South Africans were concerned about unemployment, they were more concerned about COVID-19. This month, however, the same survey shows that people are more concerned about employment and the economy than the virus itself. Our Finance Minister, Bwalya, has asked Parliament to be allowed to table an emergency budget tomorrow, and this will be closely watched. Of course, in the absence of a growing economy, the question is where the funding that we so desperately need will come from. There's limited scope for further tax measures in a country like ours, where the largest contributor to the national revenue is personal income tax. But on a positive note, the government has introduced a number of financial assistance measures for individuals and for businesses. And it's encouraging that To support government's efforts, the private sector-driven Solidarity Fund has received 2.7 billion rand in commitments from more than 175,000 individuals and 1,500 companies and foundations. So there's certainly a real appreciation of the devastating effect of the pandemic and a need for us to support those who are most vulnerable. Stop there.
Thanks, Tam. That's great. Elton, maybe you could give us your perspective, not only in Malawi, but also more broadly in the COMESA region.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. It's good to have you all. Let me start with Malawi. I think in Malawi, what has happened is we waited for the first announcement of the first case, which was reported on the 2nd of April. And then the government took certain remedial measures, printed measures like passing, a law, a regulation under the Public Health Act, which was going to enable it to operate within the confines of the law, like imposing a lockdown and everything else. Then they moved ahead and announced its intention of a lockdown on the 14th of April, but that was challenged. There's an injunction as we speak. So we never went to a lockdown. But again, there were other directives which government announced, which helps everyone else, businesses, how to deal with things. And one of the measures was to observe social distancing in workplaces. So although we didn't go on a lockdown, there was a lot of social distancing, and that forced a lot of companies to put staff on rotational basis, some who could operate from home, allowed to operate from home. And that has had an impact on the economy. Now, the most hit in Malawi has been the tourism sector, which contributes, just like in Zambia, about 7% of the GDP. Now, they anticipate, and the projection by the Reserve Bank of Malawi that that industry only will contract by 9.9% by the end of 2020. But there's been good news from the World Bank, which projected that initially in 2019, they had projected that Malawi's GDP will grow by 4.4 in 2020. Now they've just revised it and say it will grow by 3.2, which is still good. Now, there are factors to that. And one of the factors has been that we've a very good weather this year, and the harvest in a lot of crops is going to be great. As you know, Malawi is highly dependent on agriculture sector, commodity, raw. So I think that has enabled to cushion automatically. But still, there's going to be challenges because, as we know, supply chains have been disrupted. So a lot of those exports may not be able to be exported out there. So the impact is still being assessed, how it's going to continue affecting the country. But in general, it's not as bad. It's just that like the tourism sector and other sectors, mostly service sectors, are having to lay off people. And there's going to be a challenge in terms of, if you link it to that, a lot of government revenue comes from income tax. So companies are not performing, and pay as you earn payee is going to be affected as well. So that's going to have a challenge. And as this is again for a second year in a row, it's an election year. We had the first tripartite elections last year, and we're having a fresh presidential elections this year, actually today, ironically. So it will all depend on how it pans out from today moving forward. So everything I'm saying here has to also be looked at with that caution that it depends with how the country is going to move forward from today or from tomorrow as the announcement starts coming out about the presidential elections. Now, just touching a little bit about COMESA, I had a chat with last week, the Chief Executive and Director of COMESA Competition Commission, George Lipimile, And I think his views generally are that he anticipates a lot of African countries, and I think I'll get back to that, later on, that some of countries may want to go into some protectionism, trying to use trade policies to protect their SMEs and certain very, strategic industries, sectors. And most of those sectors will be in agriculture and artisanal mining and all that. So we should expect that. But these are, again, areas which are not highly affected by competition enforcement, as we know that the focus mostly it's on the core industries, manufacturing, and the service sectors. And I think briefly for now, that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks, Elton. That's great. Shianee, what is the picture like in Mauritius?
Well, thank you, Heather, and good afternoon to everyone present today on this webinar. Well, indeed, Mauritius has also been affected by the COVID-19 crisis. The government has adopted a very strict approach in the handling of the pandemic. Well, following the onset of the first 3 cases of the virus, the government had imposed a national lockdown as from the 20th of March for an initial period of 2 weeks, except for the provision of essential services. This initial period was extended to the 1st of June, and the situation was being monitored quite closely by the health authorities and the government. Having had no new domestic cases for a period of nearly a month, the government partially lifted the lockdown of the 1st of June. This meant that businesses and commercial activities could resume, while we still had some prohibitions on large gatherings. A full lift was authorized as from the 15th of June. In terms of statistics, Mauritius has had a total of 337 cases, including 10 deaths. The situation posed by COVID-19 is that although businesses have resumed, cautionary measures are still being practiced. For example, work from home is being encouraged wherever it is possible. Also, the pandemic has had a very negative impact on the economy of Mauritius, with the tourism and the aviation industries being mostly affected. The national airline has been put in administration, and the forecasts of the hotel industry are quite dim. In his budget speech presented earlier this month, the Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development forecasted a GDP contraction of up to 11%. Unemployment rates are expected to go up to 17%. In order to contain the impact of the crisis, certain measures have already been undertaken by the government. Through the COVID-19 Act 2020, which was enacted in May earlier this year, the government introduced the wage assistance schemes to financially assist businesses in terms of their cash flow, although this will be recouped from the companies. We have also seen greater flexibility and protection being afforded to workers. A stay has been introduced for any voluntary liquidation or winding up of domestic companies for a period of up to 3 months after the passing of the COVID-19. But this does not apply to global companies. As for the global sector, we have noticed a slowdown in transactional matters due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Matters have been made worse since the announcement of a listing of Mauritius on the European Commission's high-risk jurisdiction, further to a new methodology adopted by the EU. It is to be noted, though, that this listing is provisional and will only become effective as from the 1st of October 2020. The announcement by the European Commission has come as a shockwave to the whole of the industry and its practitioners. Mauritius has a strong reputation and strong, robust AML and CFT framework, and has been working closely with the FATF to implement all the recommendation actions. Out of the 58 action points, only 5 were remaining, and Mauritius had until September 2021 to implement the outstanding items. So since the announcement by the EU, The government, in collaboration with the industry players, have been doubling efforts to remove Mauritius from this high-risk list. In his budget speech, the Minister of Finance also announced a series of measures to be in line with the recommendations of the FATF and to further accelerate the implementation program with the aim of completion by the end of September this year. Yesterday, the Minister of Financial Services and Good Governance met with the ambassador of the EU, who has also promised to lend Mauritius its support. With Mauritius being a gateway to investment in Africa, we do hope that we come off the EU high-risk list before the 1st of October 2020, as otherwise the consequences will be quite far-reaching and materially affect the whole sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Shianee. David, would you like to give us some comments from a Ugandan perspective? And then last but not least, we'll ask Wilbert about Tanzania.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everybody. Uganda had a hard lockdown starting on the 1st of April of this year. We've had our first case of COVID on around the first confirmed case on around the 22nd of March. We've since got into about 775 cases. And in the middle of the hard lockdown, we had all shops, all businesses closed down except essential services. The essential services were in farming, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, food, and TMT, telecoms, media, and generally anything that was to do with energy was deemed essential. A lot of our lockdown policy was set down under the Public Health Act, but we've also had, I suppose, an interesting legal situation where a lot of the guidelines have been issued by His Excellency the President, and operationalization of them has not been done through gazetting or any form of statutory instrument. So to a certain extent, we've been going back to rule by decree, but it was consensus based largely due to the safety challenge that COVID presented to the population. In terms of the economic effect, we're a landlocked country, and therefore we had to allow transportation of imports and exports to continue. So a lot of imports come in by road through Kenya and Tanzania. And the situation in Tanzania and in Kenya was the COVID situation and the economic situation in both those countries was very closely linked with ours. Kenya, as we know and we'll hear shortly, had some form of lockdown and monitoring of COVID. Tanzania had a slightly different situation, as we shall hear subsequently, but from Dr. Wilbert. Our situation quickly turned from COVID cases imported from Europe, from China, Europe, and the Middle East, to COVID cases being imported by truck drivers who are coming in, bringing imports into the country or taking our exports out. So we've had to tread a fine line between closing down the trucks and therefore squeezing the economy even further, or letting the trucks through and having a situation where the COVID numbers go up. I think we have some kind of semblance of an arrangement with Kenya, and that's easing the pressure at the border with Kenya. The situation with Tanzania is, I think, at a standstill. The Economic Policy Research Center says that 75%, this is a survey they did in May, 75% of the businesses that they surveyed had laid off or considering laying off employees. The hardest hit sectors, of course, were tourism, hospitality, which are big in our economy. But we also had, the Ministry of Finance tells us that we already had an impact from February, as early as February 2020, an adverse economic impact because of depressed demand for our exports, such as coffee, and because of disrupted supply chains from key trade partners, the biggest of which, of course, was China, which went into lockdown in January. So there was already trade, because of the lockdown in China, there were already supply chain disruptions and the like. In terms of our tax base, a little bit like Malawi that we've heard before, our biggest tax contributors are largely in the employment pay-as-you-earn space, in excise duty with fast-moving consumer goods, alcohol and soft drinks, and telecoms. Telecoms might have managed to keep their end up because of the fact that we've had to rely on the social distancing measures, increase our reliance on telecoms. But certainly the fast-moving consumer goods in terms of alcohol, soft drinks, sugar, and the like other consumables have suffered a big dip on account of the closure of hotels, on account of fewer social gatherings, and generally on account of people going out less and being restricted in what they could carry. We were part of our lockdown, the enforcement of the lockdown, the mechanism was the banning of public and private transportation. So you could walk to a supermarket to buy food, but you had to carry the food home, or you could cycle with it. So people were buying less because, short of the initial panic buy that set in as the lockdown was anticipated. Subsequently, people had to carry their supplies home, and that meant that people were buying less or had to have them delivered by motorbike. And people were generally buying less food. And so the excise, the tax contributions from that have gone down. We have had a big drive at trying to get the tax base up. A big shake-up at the Uganda Revenue Authority during the lockdown, during the COVID lockdown. The Uganda Revenue Authority has been shaken up by His Excellency the President, in the hope that there'd be more tax revenue and our revenue to GDP ratio can increase from a lowly 12, 13%, perhaps to 18, 20%. That probably means that many businesses that are already limping from effects of the lockdown are going to find issues with the Revenue Authority, making huge assessments of tax, looking into previous previous returns and looking to find loopholes, to close loopholes. That will impact M&A activity, because on top of loans coming due and not being able to be serviced, although there's a moratorium on that side, many companies are already hurting on account of depressed revenues, on account of carrying huge overheads, despite depressed revenues, are also going to have huge tax bills to look at, and therefore might need to look out for partners, or might become targets of opportunity for investors into the country. We are connected to the East African community, and in many ways, what happens in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi does impact other partners, but also we've got our own idiosyncratic situations that mean, therefore, that certain effects are amplified, and certain other effects might be mitigated that might be felt in other countries harder. I think it's been a pet subject of His Excellency the President to have more beneficiation of Ugandan products in Uganda. The disruptions that were caused to our supply chains, the fact that countries had to lock down themselves to stop travel, and the like, has played right into His Excellency's pet policy or policy project. And therefore, he's been at all COVID speeches talking about the need for Uganda to now step up in the manufacturing area. He's been talking up the manufacturers who've stepped up to fill the gaps with sanitizer, so the alcohol producers who stepped in to cover the shortfall in sales of alcohol, consumable alcohol, to start manufacturing sanitizer, plastic manufacturers who started manufacturing PPE, textiles manufacturers who've gone into manufacturing of masks, all those things, COVID has been a trend accelerator for His Excellency's Buy Uganda, Build Uganda project. And I think other than that, I don't want to add far more. My 5 minutes might be up. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That's great. Wilbert, would you like to comment from a Tanzania perspective?
Yeah, indeed. Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Of course, it's a challenge to be the last to speak when everybody has heard all the good speeches. Now, for Tanzania, of course, as it has been mentioned by my neighbors, we've had no lockdown. The first case was announced on the 16th of March, and 2 days later, schools and universities were closed. Gatherings like in clubs and ceremonies, weddings and stuff were banned, and then social distancing, using of masks, washing hands were all encouraged as a precaution against the spread of the virus. The president was very clear. Just to give you a little background, 80% of Tanzania's tax revenue comes from Dar es Salaam, one city. And the president said he was not going to lock down Dar es Salaam, indeed not lock down any city or close borders because of the virus, because otherwise that will bring the economy to a halt. And that has been the case. Of course, businesses were on their own to find their own measures to fight against the virus. Many services, businesses started working remotely, of course, including our office. Manufacturing and tourism were hit very hard because they could not really meet all the health requirements, while at the same time producing. One example is the production of soft drinks. Now, where there are no ceremonies, no gatherings, restaurants closed, bars closed, even beer was not selling, including soft drinks, of course. So that was one of the clear consequences. Now, what did government do to deal with the situation? Although they did not announce it directly or openly, the Minister for Finance did give amnesty to taxpayers who have been assessed the taxes. They were given amnesty on the amounts which they were assessed as interest or penalties. And then the central bank also kind of adjusted the interest rates to encourage businesses, give them capacity to borrow. These measures were taken, and at the same time, some of the basic things which were required during this time, like hand sanitizers, masks, and other related things, were suddenly scarce and a lot more expensive. And the competition authority had to issue a warning against such behavior, citing the Fair Competition Act, that such behavior was, of course, criminal, and anybody found pursuing these illegal hikes, the law will take its course. So that's one statement we had from the competition authority. Now, because there was no lockdown, there was also concern about the numbers, the rising numbers. By the end of April, there were about 509 positive cases, 21 fatalities, but also 183 had recovered. But then the head of state said, I don't trust our laboratories. So, and he said, announcing these numbers serves no purpose. The important thing is for us to take all the precautions against the spread of the virus. So since the end of April, there's been no announcement on any statistics on the virus. So as we speak, the only numbers known are the end of April numbers. So this is not very helpful because then we can't tell what the situation is. And as time was passing, by last week, the president announced, end of mid-May, he announced that the universities should reopen by the 1st of June, which happened, and also high schools should open by then. There's been a further announcement following closure of parliament that all other schools, primary schools, and should be open, and all other activities. So restaurants are now open, clubs are open. I live near at least three nightclubs. It's now quite noisy, and my investigation shows that there's no social distancing. Very few people now wear masks. Now, I'm concerned, but I can't say with the precision of science what this might mean. But certainly, because it's a virus, I can imagine it is spreading. Someone told me, I don't know if it is scientific, that if you are below 35, your risk of dying of COVID is very low. And 85% of Tanzanians are under 35 years. The only person who is at risk is the likes of me and other older guys. So hotels have started opening up now. Even tourist hotels, tourist businesses has resumed. Some airlines have resumed, including Ethiopian and Qatar. Air Tanzania is also flying to India. So it looks like it's business as usual, but we still continue to take precautions. I still have my mask next to me. I'd gone to the competition authority this morning for a meeting. I had my mask on. Now the point is, all public offices had never closed. The competition authority has been continuing to do its business as if there was no virus. The only difference I saw today at the reception, they put a glass pane, and they say this is to minimize the possibility that stakeholders of the authority may breathe into the place viruses, which is a good point. They have sanitizers around, and I noticed, I even went through the offices, there's good social distancing, but no public office had ever closed during all this time, except a few courts who had the capacity were doing proceedings remotely. That's the commercial court was doing it, part of the Court of Appeal was doing it. But I guess what I can say is we just have to wait and see what happens in the next few months. I'm not praying for the worst for Tanzania. I'm just praying that people take precautions and continue to be safe. I guess maybe it will be best if we engage in questions and answers at this stage. Otherwise, I could talk for the rest of the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Wilbert. That's a very interesting contrast, I think, with what other people have been telling us. And now last but certainly, Joyce, can you tell us about Kenya? And in particular, we had a question about whether an economy that's so dependent on tourism like Kenya has got any particular measures in mind.
Thank you, Heather, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined this webinar. Yes, as Wilbert said, I think going last is probably the hardest after all of those excellent people who've gone ahead of me, but I will try and cover. So I think I'll cover the question last if I just go through what I've sort of put together. So I think the first case in Kenya, the first COVID case was reported on 13th of March. And the numbers as at yesterday show that there's a total number of 4,797 confirmed cases with 125 deaths and 1,680 recoveries so far. And in terms of the impact it's had on the economy generally, in 2019, Kenya's GDP growth averaged about 5.4%. And the projections for 2020 had been that it would grow by about 6%. And this was amid robust private consumption, higher credit growth, and just rising public and private investment. However, in view of the pandemic, the GDP growth rate in Kenya now is expected to contract to about 1%. And depending on who you ask, some say it's expected to be a negative growth. But that, of course, remains to be seen. And the rating that has been given to Kenya by Moody's has now been changed from a previous outlook of stable to one of negative. So I think so as far as the economy is concerned, it's similar to many of the other countries. It's not a great outlook. In terms of the direct impact that COVID has had in Kenya on employment, it's estimated about approximately 300,000 people in the formal sector have lost their jobs so far as a result of COVID. This excludes employees who are on unpaid leave, those who have taken pay cuts, and of course those in the informal sector who, it's quite difficult to estimate what the impact has been in the informal sector. And then, of course, the other expectation is that SMEs are going to shut down due to reductions in household and business spending as a result of liquidity constraints that are driven by COVID. And I think the hardest hit sectors are expected to be the airline industry and hospitality as well. Now, if I could address the question here about specific measures, I know the government has been talking about giving potentially some breaks, tax breaks and other sort of crutches to these two industries in particular, but they haven't made any formal declarations or statements in exactly what those measures are going to look like. So we are watching the space, and we wait to see exactly what they're going to propose. But I will talk about some tax measures that might also indirectly benefit those sectors. So the way the Kenyan government sort of approached this, they have put in place some mitigating measures. In the first part to contain the spread of the virus, and then on the second part to minimize the economic impact and financial impact on the country. So I'll just go through some of these very quickly. So in terms of measures to contain the spread, on 25th of March, all international flights to Kenya were suspended with the exception of cargo flights. And then a dusk to dawn curfew was implemented effective 27th of March. So this started out as a curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. For the first 21 days, I believe it was. And then we've had two subsequent extensions of this curfew. And currently, the curfew is still ongoing, although the times have been altered to 9 p.m., from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. And during the curfew periods, only essential services personnel are allowed outside. So this is sort of, medical providers, people in the food distribution industry as well are deemed to be essential services, as well as lawyers. After the lawyers went to court, they were included as essential services as well. The government also banned movement by road, rail, or air in and out of several counties, in particular Nairobi, Mombasa, Kilifi, and Kwale. Some of those restrictions had been lifted, but the one with respect to Nairobi still remains. All churches, mosques, and other social gatherings were suspended, and funerals were also restricted to immediate family members only. At the moment, it's no more than 15 people are permitted to be at gatherings. All learning institutions were closed and remained so. All public service vehicles were directed to limit the number of passengers that they carry to 50% of the vehicle's capacity. So that's to encourage social distancing. There's also a mandatory requirement to wear masks while in public places. All eateries, although for the first stretch of the curfew, restaurants were also closed. This was subsequently lifted, and eateries were allowed to open, subject to obtaining proper certification from the Ministry of Health. But then they also have to adhere to the curfew, so they're required to be closed during the curfew hours. And then as a guideline, I think the government sort of said to employers, we're not asking you to work from home, but to the extent that you And so you'll find a number of companies in Kenya are, to the extent that they can, are exercising working from home policies. And certainly you will find social distancing and sanitizer and masks has become a new way of life. Now, in terms of the measures the government took to limit the human and economic impact of the pandemic, one of the significant things the government did was to offer some tax reliefs. For example, PAYE was reduced from 30% to 25%. The resident corporate income tax rate was reduced from 30% to 25%. VAT also was reduced from 16% to 14%. And then another sort of useful thing that the government did as by way of directive, it directed the Nairobi County government and the Kenya Power Company not to disconnect water and electricity over unpaid bills. This announcement was made on the 1st of April, but thankfully it turned out not to be an April Fool's joke. There's also been a directive issued by the government on banks, directing banks to provide relief to borrowers, whether they're personal loans or whether they're SMEs or corporate borrowers. So banks have been encouraged to restructure loans on a case-by-case basis, but taking into account the circumstances. But this was somewhat sort of limited to only those loans that were sort of up to date and compliant as at 2nd of March 2020. There's also been a COVID fund that was established by the government. And essentially its principal object is to mobilize resources from government and private sector to help contain the spread, the effects, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Kenya. And then I think the government also, similar to Tanzania, a huge drive to ensure some kind of business continuity from the government offices front. So as far as the registries, whether it's the lands registries, the Industrial Property Institute registry, and the judiciary, to a large extent, if I could mention others, the Competition Authority, the IRA, all of these have remained largely open, although they have been sort of working with limited staff numbers. Again, they have encouraged those who can work from home to work from home. And also they're using resources such as Zoom and other online platforms to avoid physical contact or physical meetings. And if I could just highlight sort of one private sector initiative that, is sort of a very positive and outcome that Kenya has experienced. Obviously for listed companies, annual general meetings are required to be held within a specific time period. And we had a recent success when an application was made by us on behalf of our client, WPP Scan Group, where we asked the court to allow listed companies to have annual general meetings through a virtual network. And that has actually been quite a groundbreaking outcome. And it's now allowing all listed companies working together with the NSC and the CMA to allow them to have their AGMs. And the interesting outcome of this is it's reported attendance at AGMs has not tripled, it's gone up tenfold, compared to when they were having physical meetings. So I think that's sort of a positive note that I would end on my Kenya perspective. Thanks.
I think the experience of online tribunal hearings in South Africa has similarly led to a surge in interest and attendance. I just want to remind our audience, please, to complete the poll if you haven't already done so. We've got quite a few people that have done so, and thank you for the questions. Please keep them coming in. We are going to address them. I'd like to move now just to talk to people about what they think the impact of these developments might be on African regulators, and specifically competition regulators, but of course not limited to them. Tamara, can we start with you in South Africa? Do you think that these developments are going to affect how the Competition Commission in South Africa do their work? And what are you expecting to see as a result in the next 12 to 18 months as far as mergers go?
Thanks, Heather. Well, I think it seems inevitable that across a range of sectors, we'll be seeing some consolidation and acquisitions. There'll always be companies who are better placed to weather the storm and may be able to acquire firms in financial distress and even turn the ship around. The South African Competition Commission has said that they will they expect more mergers featuring distressed firms, but that they will not be relaxing their standard for merger reviews. And of course, without a meaningful competition assessment, there is the risk that the current crisis could result in higher market concentration. This is particularly concerning in the South African context, where so much effort has gone into trying to open up our economy, which has traditionally been highly concentrated, to a greater participation and a greater spread of ownership. And it's clear that we still have a long way to go there. But even if the Commission will not relax its merger review standards, it does seem that our authority will have to look at mergers in a slightly different way, just because of changed circumstances. For example, an acquisition that may have been seen as creating too strong a market position and being the kind of transaction that a regulator would want to prohibit, in those kinds of cases, the authorities will really have to look at what the outcome will be without the merger, the so-called counterfactual, and consider that very carefully. If a target is likely to exit the market, not only is that an issue from a competition perspective, but also from an employment perspective in South Africa. And so I think that mergers that can preserve employment and ensure sustainability will need to be given very serious consideration by our regulators to be approved, even where there may be harm to competition. I also think that we may see more creative behavioral remedies being imposed or even being offered by merging parties as a way to resolve competition concerns, but still get a deal across the line. The South African Competition Commission, in my experience, has been very expedient and shows a willingness to try to expedite urgent matters. So going forward, there will be, I think, many failing firm arguments that will be put up with a lot of pressure on the Commission to assess and issue a decision quickly in order for a target firm to be saved. I think that what will be challenging for the Commission is to conduct an assessment as to whether or not a firm is actually a failing firm and likely to exit the market without the merger, or whether it's just negatively impacted by the pandemic but should survive the crisis. So it will be interesting to see how regulators will assess this and what timeframes they will look at for the performance or lack of performance of the failing firm. And I think they'll be under a lot of pressure to do so quite urgently. Finally, in South Africa, the Competition Commission has, as many people would know, insisted on a definitive statement by merging parties that there will be no job losses as a consequence of a merger. And where the parties haven't been in a position to give such a statement, the Commission typically imposes a moratorium on job losses for a period of time post-merger, 2 years often, but sometimes longer. I think going forward, there'll be many scenarios where the Commission is faced with merging parties saying, we can't guarantee that there won't be job losses. In fact, there may be job losses, but without this merger, certainly more jobs will be lost. Thanks.
That's great. Shianee, if we can pick up with you, as I understand it, there's a voluntary merger regime that applies in Mauritius. So how will your authority be able to cope with a wave of consolidation or a series of mergers that bring job losses or other public interest effects?
Yes, indeed. So what happened was during the crisis, the Competition Commission of Mauritius, or the CCM, had issued a communique to state that it was conscious of the extraordinary circumstances facing business in view of the pandemic, and that it understands that some businesses may be called upon to collaborate among themselves in the public interest to ensure that essential products and services continue to be supplied during the crisis. Well, the stand taken by the CCM was that it would not unduly constrain or impede necessary and critical cooperation, which are in the consumers' and public interest, and which does not go further or last longer than what is necessary. We understand that this would only apply to those parties who are involved in the supply or purchase of essential goods and services. A second communique was issued by the CCM post the COVID-19 crisis to state that the domestic laws will be enforced with much rigor. Such a stand by the CCM was explained by past experiences which have shown that in a period of economic downturn, businesses may be tempted to form cartels or use their power on the market to act anti-competitively. And as you mentioned, under our laws, there are no mandatory notifications to be made to the CCM in relation to mergers, well, either before or after the implementation of the merger. The CCM, however, does have the power to review a merger situation where the market threshold of 30% is reached, and it has reasonable grounds to believe that the merger would substantially lessen competition. It has always been the approach of the CCM to encourage merging parties to seek a voluntary guidance or engage with the CCM earlier on in the transaction, a process known as the pre-notification consultations. This approach has been reiterated or emphasized in the latest communique by the CCM. So we therefore do not expect any change in the approach of the CCM towards reviewing merger situations. So when assessing a merger situation and before finalizing on any remedial solutions, the CCM is required to consider any offsetting benefits prescribed in our laws, which have been set out as safety of goods and services, the efficiency with which goods are produced, supplied or distributed, the development and use of new and improved goods and services, the promotion of technological and economic progress, and the benefits likely to be shared by the consumers and business in general. Our law does not further define the phrase technological and economic progress, or does it expand, nor does it expand on the meaning of this phrase. During the review by the CCM of the acquisition of the Apollo Bowmans Hospital by Cell Healthcare in 2017, a public benefit consideration element was raised, as the acquiring party had agreed to preserve some 686 jobs, which would otherwise have been lost with the closure of the hospital. And the CCM held that factors such as safeguarding employment, income, and development of the medical sector would fall under the offsetting public benefit considerations. So with the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, we would expect enterprises making more and more use of these arguments as an offsetting benefit in relation to the merger situations.
That's great, thank you. And David, what happens in Uganda, where I understand there isn't a separate competition regime as such?
Thanks, Heather. Yes, Uganda doesn't have an overarching competition regime. And when I'm talking about competition, I'm like Dr. Kapinga talking about COVID for Tanzania. We have sector regulators who, either by reason of the sectoral legislation or simply using prudential measures, apply competition law principles when determining whether to approve controlled mergers. For example, in the banks, it's the Bank of Uganda. For telecom sector, it's the Uganda Communications Commission. For insurance, it's the National Insurance Regulatory Authority, etc. Different sectoral regulators who apply competition law policies, principles to determine whether to allow individual mergers or acquisitions in their sectors. So in the absence of an overarching competition authority, you'll probably find that some sectors, largely driven by necessity and the effect of the COVID lockdown, may have a more nationalistic outlook to mergers. So in areas such as food production, such as pharmaceuticals, such as manufacturing of things deemed essential, government will be looking to ensure that we have more control and may therefore be more concerned about the nature of the people who are intending to acquire, may look at monopoly situations and may be more inclined to pay attention, for example, to consumer complaints. We've seen that definitely in the renewal of the MTN license recently, that consumer complaints were put to the forefront and other issues, largely because there was also a kind of big debate around the figure, the fee, about the licensing. These competition issues then came in, its dominance, how it's been using its dominant position in the market, and the effect on other markets such as fintech development and the like. On the other hand, COVID pressures to do with failing businesses, jobs, and the like will, as we said earlier, present targets of opportunity. And you may find that in sectors such as the financial services sector, insurance, banking, and the like, there'll be a willingness or even an eagerness to invite foreign capital to come in and come in quickly in order to shore up those players that might find themselves limping as a result of the COVID lockdown. And at that point in time, the sectoral regulators will be looking more to how many jobs can we save, the effect on the economy if a company is allowed to go down. So Uganda might be a useful test tube to see how a horses for courses approach to competition law might apply. And I think we are in for a kind of very interesting period where in different sectors there'll be enhanced nationalism, and in other sectors maybe even more liberalism and a wider open door. And that's Uganda's situation in sum.
Thank you. Bwalya, I understand that in Zambia, there's been a strong focus on public interest concerns in merger reviews already. Do you expect this to be more of a trend in the wake of COVID?
Yes, Heather, we do see the Commission continuing to utilize the public interest and, more importantly, the socioeconomic considerations in evaluating mergers. However, this will need to be a balancing act of both interests of businesses to continue to operate in the market and the interests of the public in terms of employment, as well as maintaining supplier contracts, for example. We take the view that the Commission is cognizant of the effect of the pandemic on businesses and may not take a hard approach on public interest considerations as we've seen in the past.
And Wilbert, from your perspective in Tanzania, do you expect more of these conditions, or do you expect some difficulty in companies being able to offer commitments?
Well, I don't know what I should say, but I've seen that there is a sense in recent legislation which kind of encourages more of mergers and acquisitions because of an amendment to a previous provision which used to levy a penalty of 10% of the global turnover of the merging parties if they were found to have committed an offense under the Fair Competition Act, up to 10%. Now, lately they removed the global spread of the penalty of the turnover and focused only on the target. Now this is quite significant, and that's about the only instrument which has come in the midst of COVID. And as I said, the Competition Authority never stopped doing business. In fact, in March, as I said, it issued warnings to businesses which were hiking prices, not only for COVID-related products or commodities, but also sugar. Sugar was also an issue during this period, and the Minister for Industries, who is also the parent ministry for the Competition Authority, made an intervention. I see that the recent experience with COVID has kind of made the Competition Authority a lot more friendly. Not that it was not accessible. It's usually very accessible. They assist businesses a lot to achieve their transactional objectives. Although of course there are the usual challenges here and there. So there will be no instruments, no legislative instruments to indicate that there will be a change from the old situation. That's about the only thing I can say.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. I want to just switch to talking a little bit about SMMEs, and then we will have the results of our poll, which it looks like most people that are with us have now completed. Everybody in one way or another has mentioned the impact of the pandemic on small firms. And so I think it would be interesting to hear from Joyce in particular what tools the Competition Authority in Kenya has at its disposal to protect small businesses who may be feeling a disproportionate impact of this pandemic.
Yeah. So I think, as others have mentioned, the public interest tool in merger assessment is one the authority has used in the past as a means of protecting SMEs, and I think they will continue to do that. So this has usually taken the form of in merger approvals, where the authority will issue a condition that not only requires the parties to commit to saving X number of jobs, but also commits to the merged entity retaining contractual terms with suppliers, many of whom are SMEs. So I think we'll expect to see that trend continuing. Another tool that the Competition Authority has available to it at the moment is the buyer power provisions, which it introduced back in 2016. And these were introduced in the context, it was shortly after Nakumatt, which was the biggest supermarket at the time, had failed. And the concern was that as a result of its failure, it had sort of resulted in foreclosure of a number of suppliers due to its buyer power. So in the context of COVID, we've seen the authority already take some steps to use those buyer power provisions to try and take some steps to see what's happening in the market, particularly in the retail space, and what impact that's having on suppliers, again, many of whom are SMEs. So buyer power, broadly defined, it's the ability of a buyer to obtain terms of supply that are more favorable than a supplier's ordinary terms. And what the authority did actually in May, early in May, is it issued a public notice asking local suppliers who are owed money by any major retail supermarkets to report, to provide the information to the authority. And this was sort of if they were owed money beyond a period of 90 days, and if that debt, if I can call it that, was without a justifiable reason, or if it was as a in breach of the contract that the supplier had with the supermarket. So this sort of it has happened in the wake of complaints. There's another supermarket in Kenya called Tusky Supermarket, which it's blaming the impact of COVID on its business, saying that social distancing and reduced operating hours have resulted in lower traffic and therefore lower revenue in its stores. So it issued a public notice saying that it's going to have to restructure payments owed to suppliers in this market. So we're seeing that the authority is keeping its pulse quite close to what's happening on the ground. The investigation is still very much ongoing, but we do expect to see the authority to use the, continuing to use this tool throughout this COVID period and even in the post-COVID period, just as another means of protecting and looking out for SMEs.
Joyce, there was a question which I think is directed at you and what happens in Kenya. If merging parties have made commitments or they've agreed to conditions for their transactions, those may now be unaffordable or impossible to honor. What do you imagine is going to happen with those?
So the authority hasn't made any express statements in how those should be dealt with, but we would expect them to adopt their normal approach, which is every sort of 12 months post an approval being issued by the authority, they will conduct a post-compliance check. And they will write to the parties or attend the parties' premises and ask them, can we see how you've complied with the conditions that we imposed on your merger approval? However, in practice, where parties are having difficulty complying with a condition for whatever reason, we do encourage that they be proactive and engage the authority and to begin the discussions, because the authority is sort of open to taking into account reasonable and justifiable reasons as to why parties can't comply with a condition. So in a scenario like that, even if the authority hasn't expressly put forward its position, we would encourage parties to be proactive, to engage with the authority, and to take that first step to initiate a discussion around why are they finding it difficult to comply, and what specifics around the COVID situation are making it difficult to comply, and then getting a way to get a variation or some kind of leniency around how that condition will be interpreted.
Thank you. Tamara, maybe you'd like to talk about South Africa for a little bit, given the strong focus that our authority has been placing on pricing to SMMEs by dominant suppliers, but also dominant firms pushing unfair terms or prices onto very small suppliers.
Yes, thanks, Heather. So in South Africa, SMEs and firms owned by historically disadvantaged persons, which we refer to as HDPs, are afforded greater protection by way of the recently introduced buyer power and price discrimination provisions. Although I should add quickly that Kenya had sprinted ahead of us and introduced its buyer power provisions before South Africa did. So these mechanisms are there. As Heather's mentioned, the buyer power provisions in South Africa seek to prohibit dominant firms from imposing unfair pricing or trading conditions on their SME suppliers or their HDP suppliers. And although we haven't seen any cases where these have been applied at this stage, we do expect that these mechanisms are what our regulator will use. But maybe just to add, quite interestingly, the Commission has, since the start of COVID-19, also pursued a number of firms that are seen as small, or at least relatively small, for engaging in price gouging in the context of COVID-19. So small firms haven't always managed to pass before the Commission.
Thanks, Tamara. Elton, maybe you could just talk from a regional perspective. Obviously, these issues have been of importance in COMESA as well. Do you think we're going to see a more active role for the COMESA Commission in the wake of the pandemic?
Yes, I think I anticipate a more role of COMESA in the region, because what is going to happen is that a lot of national authorities are going to look up to COMESA to take that leading law to enforce, because as it has already been alluded to, markets are going to be concentrated. It's already happening. SMEs and distress, and a lot of them are going to be consolidating. So there's going to be that role coming up significantly. Now, particularly speaking about mergers, I suspect the role of the COMESA will still be the same. And this is because the COMESA itself had said that they still want to have the mandate to be able to enforce mergers in all sectors. So unless if a member states, actually puts in their legislation an exemption of a sector, then it will be hands off of COMESA. And that just responds to one of the questions I saw, that will the trade barriers increase and affect competition policy? In terms of COMESA law, that can only happen if the member state actually legislate to that effect. Then there are even protocols to be followed. So a member state cannot just wake up and legislate on that. They have to follow the procedures within the protocols to enable that. But in terms of the mergers, what we're going to see, as we know, the COMESA Commission actually regrets mergers which have got substantial lessening of competition. Now, those are the ones which are mandatory. If they meet a threshold, they are mandatory. for notification, and they can be challenged, Now, there are two key provisions in COMESA which enable, to justify a merger. One of them is about technological advancement, but the other one, which is quite interesting, is about public interest. Now, the sort of public interest is quite different from the perspective of public interest of the South African consideration. The COMESA one is purely on competition grounds. And COVID has given a very good opportunity, which exposes the sort of, provisions which are in the COMESA regulations, which actually speaks to what COMESA has exposed, because a lot of member states now are worried with the things which has been the availability of products, supply chains being affected. So what you see in the grounds for public interest on COMESA, there are three clear ones. One of them is that when allowing a merger on public interest grounds, the Commission is supposed to review whether that merger is going to increase issues about availability of products and distribution. And this is going to be key, as we have all experienced. There's been shortages of products, and other issues about, it has to lead to low, this is a public interest, mind you, from COMESA perspective. It has to lead to low prices, but higher quality. So you can see, you're demanding low price, but at a higher quality. That can, that can prove to be a challenge. And again, it has to demonstrate that it gives a choice to the consumers. Now, one of the key issues which keeps coming when members are filing, you would see that most of the business will come up to COMESA and say that this is a failing firm, there's going to be loss of job, job losses. Now, COMESA, before, they never took that lightly. They were very strict that you have to justify, you have to demonstrate what you mean. You cannot just show up and say job losses. And the interest has been that the sort of job losses are the ones which have got an impact on the entire economy of a member state. So just confining on four white-collar jobs, that's not very, very appetizing to COMESA. They would look at, is it sort of a block of maybe a unit, a closure of a department, and to lead to a dozens of people, and this measure is going to save. Now, just going quickly back to what David had said, that a lot of businesses within the region are going to go out there to look, for foreign investors to come in. I think this again is going to be a factor which COMESA is going to take into consideration seriously. Let's give an example in the financial services sector, even in the tourism sector. A lot of hotels or banks are going to be under distress, and there are those brands which are got the financial muscle to go through this the economic crisis, and with those sort of measures, obviously, the COMESA Competition Commission will have to think twice that, do we really just have to put strict measures here, but we have to look in the dynamics that we're just coming out of COVID. So post-COVID, the role of the CCC is going to significantly go higher. And again, it will also help in terms of having one-stop shop in terms of measure, all measures with the regional dimension are likely going to now be, channeled to Lilongwe. I think that's all I can say. Thanks.
Thank you, Elton. Okay, unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time, so I think it might be interesting if we can have a look at our poll results. We asked you to tell us whether you thought that competition authorities in Africa were likely to allow more mergers and greater consolidation. A very significant majority of people said yes, they did think so. Should competition authorities allow more collaboration? Very interesting. An overwhelming majority of people said they thought that that should be allowed. Similarly, a lot of people thought that we were likely to see a greater focus on public interest. That seems to accord with what our panelists have been saying today. But interestingly, that perhaps we need more measures or more targeted measures to protect SMMEs in the hands of competition authorities on the continent. And then last but not least, I want to ask the question, and perhaps we can ask our panelists in the time that we have remaining. We asked whether African countries have got adequate mechanisms to deal with protecting their strategic assets from foreign takeovers. If African firms find themselves in a weakened position, they are potentially very attractive takeover targets. And it would be interesting to hear whether people think that we've got adequate measures to deal with that, either under the auspices of our existing competition legislation or whether there's some other legislation that applies. Tam, maybe you want to touch on that in South Africa to kick us off.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. So in South Africa, national security considerations have been introduced to the Competition Act, but they haven't yet been brought into effect. So at this point in time, they're not available for companies to be used. They will allow for intervention in merger proceedings involving a foreign acquiring firm. And what is contemplated is an assessment by an executive body in a process that will be separate from and prior to the merger assessment that would take place under the Competition Act. So our president will have to constitute a committee comprised of cabinet members and other public officials responsible for determining whether specific transactions may have an adverse effect on the national security interests of the country. So while this is still to be determined, the guidance set out in the legislation reflects that a very broad range of interests could fall within this list. I won't go into all of those now, but some consternation has been raised in that regard because it covers potentially so many areas. And of course, while a number of jurisdictions around the world have foreign takeover laws to protect their strategic assets and businesses, in the South African context, of course, a balance will have to be struck between creating a regime that allows for appropriate intervention for the sake of the preservation of clearly defined national security interests and the need to foster an environment that is conducive to investment and confidence in the South African economy.
Thanks, Tamara. David, would you like to comment from a Uganda perspective? How would this be dealt with in your country?
It's difficult to tell in terms of, as I said, in the absence of an overarching policy. I think it'll be a case-by-case basis, but a little bit like South Africa, the COVID situation has shown national security and national economic interests being key, and certainly the neoliberal wave that had previously kind of swept through this part of the world with privatization and the like, and Uganda being at the forefront of very liberal regimes, for example, no requirements for local ownership in many sectors. We're beginning to see things like that being reversed. So I imagine that there will be concerns around the national economy, the effect on national economy, certainly effects on national security, if any particular merger or acquisition presents those, will be looked at. In one of his COVID addresses, His Excellency did point out that it had been noted, for example, that Uganda's bidding for testing kits, and the companies that were supplying told them that they had to prioritize their own governments. And that was a kind of wake-up call for Uganda to note that, in fact, on certain occasions and in certain situations, others will look at themselves first and say, you know, whilst we would have sold you this, we've got to wait for our government to let us know whether we can release it to you or not. So I think Uganda will be looking to try and apply the same kind of measures as and when, but it will be an ad hoc process rather than a wide, countrywide, economy-wide application.
And lastly, Joyce, as our time ticks away, anything to be said about whether there's anxieties about foreign investment into Kenyan strategic assets?
I think, firstly, the mandate on sort of FDI screening, it doesn't sit primarily with the Competition Authority in Kenya. It sits with sector-specific regulators. So, for example, in the banking sector, the CBK does that. The telecoms, we have the Communications Authority. So that's, that's based in statute. So, that will continue. And I think, historically, at least in the recent past, the government's been very vocal about its willingness to attract FDI, and has been, going on about how attractive a destination Kenya is for, for foreign investment. So I think it remains to be seen, and I perhaps would agree with what David is saying. Perhaps this will be applied more on a case-by-case basis. If there's a particular industry for, whether it's giving into to pressure from business or, private sector, that the government should take steps to protect certain industries. But, the policy for the government to date has been, pre-COVID, I should say, has been, that Kenya is open for business, and, we want to attract as much FDI as we can. So I suppose the short answer is it remains to be seen if that policy will change, but I expect it will be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks very much. Great. Bwalya, anything to say from us?
Yes, thanks, Heather. The position is quite similar to Kenya as well. So when it comes to strategic assets, they do have separate regulations that do govern them. And there's a higher consideration other than competition legislation, as well as protectionism that then comes in. So we obviously are looking at it in terms of it's now open. I think foreign direct investment is being encouraged to the extent possible. So we expect to see some foreign direct investment to the extent that the economy allows it. And yes, there would be some protection, but that would be dealt with by the various regulators dealing with those industries.
Shianee, anything you'd like to say just to end off on this topic?
I think it's very similar to what Bwalya and Joyce was saying as well. It has been the policy of the Mauritian government, especially now post-COVID, to attract foreign direct investment into Mauritius. We've been promoting Mauritius as well to attract investors. So I think it will be very much sector-specific and needs to be seen how these will be applied.
Thanks very much. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our formal program. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for doing all the preparation that you've done and participating in the discussion. It's been very interesting to hear a cross-section of views and approaches. And obviously these are developments we will take great interest in going forward. I'd like to say a particular thank you to all of our attendees. We had really great attendance today, and we've done our best to answer as many questions as we can through the course of the discussion, and I apologize to those of you who put some questions to us that we didn't manage to get to in the time that we've got available. But we'll try and respond to you on an individual basis in order to deal with those. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that we'll be able to convene a similar session at some stage in the future and hear if some of our panel's predictions have come true, and whether we've accurately forecasted what's going to happen to competition law enforcement in Africa in the months to come. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.